was supposed to be a typical weekend getaway. Just a group of friends escaping the stress of city life. Emily, Ben, Tom, and Sarah had planned this trip for weeks. They'd rent an isolated cabin in the woods, disconnect from technology, and enjoy nature. Little did they know, the abandoned cabin they were renting was far from the peaceful retreat they imagined. This is the terrifying story of what happened when they entered a place where darkness and isolation hung like a heavy fog. The cabin, located deep in the forest, had no immediate neighbors. The nearest town was over an hour's drive away, and cell service was non-existent. As they arrived, the first thing that struck them was the eerie silence. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural quiet that seemed to amplify every sound. The cabin itself was old, weathered, and seemed like it hadn't been inhabited for years. The wooden planks creaked under their feet, and the smell of mildew filled the air. Despite the foreboding atmosphere, the group shrugged it off as part of the charm. They unpacked their things, made a fire in the hearth, and settled in for the evening. As night fell, they gathered around the fire, telling ghost stories and sharing laughter. The night was peaceful, for the most part. But then, just as they were about to head to bed, they heard something. A faint knock at the door. At first they all froze, assuming it was some animal or the wind, but the knock came again, louder this time. Ben, who was closest to the door, hesitated but eventually opened it. To his shock, no one was standing outside. It was just the darkness of the woods, stretching endlessly into the distance. Feeling unsettled but trying to brush it off, Ben shut the door. They decided it was probably just the wind or their minds playing tricks on them. But as the night grew deeper, things started to feel more and more unnatural. Around 2 a.m., Emily woke up to a strange noise outside her window. It sounded like someone, or something, scraping the glass. Her heart raced as she stared into the dark room, her breath shallow. She quietly nudged Ben, who groggily turned over and told her to go back to sleep. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The noises continued throughout the night, but no one dared go outside to investigate. The next morning, after a restless sleep, they decided to explore the woods surrounding the cabin to take their minds off the unnerving events of the previous night. They were hoping the sunlight would ease their anxiety. As they ventured deeper into the forest, they noticed something strange. They came across a clearing that felt off, like it was watching them. In the center of the clearing stood an old tree, its bark twisted and blackened. There was something carved into the tree, strange symbols that none of them could recognize. But it wasn't just the symbols that gave them chills. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. They quickly left the clearing, but the sense of dread lingered. That evening, things took a terrifying turn. As they sat in the cabin, playing cards, the door suddenly slammed open, despite the fact that there was no wind. The temperature dropped noticeably, and they could see their breath in the air. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow and deliberate. Ben, Sarah, and Tom rushed to the door to investigate, but once again, there was nothing. Only the eerie silence of the forest. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay wide awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the cabin setting her on edge. The others were asleep, but she could swear she heard whispers, low voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The more she listened, the clearer they became. It sounded like people talking, but the language was unfamiliar and chilling. Her heart pounded as the whispers grew louder, and then, silence. Total, suffocating silence. Emily bolted upright, her breath catching in her throat. She turned to the window, and for the first time, she noticed something horrifying. There were faces staring at her through the glass, twisted, pale faces with hollow eyes, their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles. Emily screamed, waking the others, but when they rushed to her side, the faces were gone. In a panic, they packed their things, deciding to leave the cabin immediately. As they stepped outside, they were met with the same unnerving silence they'd felt when they first arrived. But this time, the woods were more suffocating than ever. It was as though the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting for them to make the wrong move. As they made their way back to the car, they realized that the road they had come down was no longer where it was supposed to be. The trees seemed to shift, the path twisting in ways they didn't remember. Every turn felt wrong, as if they were being led deeper into the forest instead of out of it. Panic set in as they realized they were lost. They wandered through the woods for what felt like hours, the oppressive silence of the forest making every step feel heavier. Then, just as hope began to fade, they stumbled upon another cabin. It was old and decrepit, even more abandoned than the first. The door creaked open on its own, and the group stepped inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, they felt it. The same cold, suffocating air from the first cabin. They were back. They had somehow ended up in the exact same spot. It was as if the forest was trapping them, forcing them to relive the horror over and over again. They couldn't escape. In that moment, they realized that the forest wasn't just a place. It was something darker, something alive, and whatever haunted it wasn't going to let them leave. The last thing they saw before the darkness claimed them was a figure standing in the doorway. A tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through their souls. And then, everything went black. This horrifying true story is one of the many that remind us of the terrifying unknowns lurking in abandoned places. What happened to Emily, Ben, Tom, and Sarah? Did they ever escape, or did they become part of the forest's dark history? The mystery remains unsolved. But one thing is for sure: the woods hide more than just trees.